I'm John Heilemann.
And I'm Mark Halperin. With all due respect to the newest McDonald's employee, Robert Gibbs, have it your way. On our DVR tonight, CSI Chicago and From Germany with Love. But first, Miami Vice. The New York Times has shoved Marco Rubio down deep into the barrel. There's the $80,000 boat, the stone pavers paid with the Florida Republican Party credit card, the liquidated retirement account, and of course, we can't forget the traffic violations, also reported by the Times a few days ago. John, the Times is on it. Is this line of inquiry about Rubio's assets, liabilities, and purchases legit? And is it, for Rubio, politically dangerous?
Yes. And yes, Mark, would be my answer to that question. I think it's legitimate in the sense that you've got a Republican here who, like many Republicans, has campaigned against profligacy and talked about the way the government wastes money. You've got to look at the guy's finances. He's a young guy on the scene, looking at how he spent his money, how he has misspent his money, how he's managed his money. Totally legitimate. And in this case, this story, I mean, there are so, as you just read through them, so many lines and paragraphs that are open to additional reporting, additional digging. There's a lot of danger here, I think, for Marco Rubio.
Look, people shouldn't treat this like it's some sort of indictment. It is totally legitimate to look at any candidate's personal finances, particularly someone like Rubio, who's led an unorthodox life in terms of how he's made his money and how he's spent it. But I do think, as you said, that there's more to come here. People who've covered him in Florida know that the Times didn't break lots of new ground, but they had some new details, and there are more to come as there are more requests for public documents, and some of the things that aren't quite adding up are looked at more. And I think people on Rubio's side who are trying to say this is an illegitimate story, or people who say that this it doesn't matter to be president, first of all, the reality is it's going to be looked at. And second, I think most people would say these are perfectly legitimate questions.
I mean, look, first of all, I mean, we'll talk about the defense that the Rubio campaign is putting forward in a moment. But I got to say, you know, if you think about just the things that a lot of voters will wonder about, you know, the fact that Rubio, there's a couple of instances in this story, and these are things that have come up before, but again, I think a lot of voters will wonder about them. You know, the houses that he bought with no money down, how exactly he got those mortgages, why those mortgages came to him. There are a lot of questions. I mean, there are more. This story raises way more questions than it answers, and again, that's why I think it's such a problem.
It answers one question. A guy who talks about how he had to pay back his student loans bought a really expensive boat. That question has been answered.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, okay, moving on to our second Rubio-related topic. Retaliating against the New York Times is, of course, Republican Party Tactics 101. Today, calling the paper elitist and arrogant, Communications Director Alex Conan said, quote, first the New York Times attacked Marco over traffic tickets, and now they think he doesn't have enough money. Of course, if he was worth millions, the Times would then attack him for being too rich, like they did to Mitt Romney. Mark, here's my question. How effective is this very traditional Republican, but in this case, Marco Rubio-centric defense attacking the New York Times?
You know, Marco Rubio, it's often been said, has led a pretty lucky life. He was extraordinarily lucky that the Times went with their story about the traffic violations that both he and his wife had over the weekend.
Right.
Because it's created this environment where people who want to rally on the Republican side to Marco Rubio against the Times can do that on social media, talk radio, etc. If this story had come out about his personal finances without the antecedent of the traffic story, I think at least some additional Republicans would have looked at the Times story and said, whoa, this guy has some questions about him. Do we really want to make him our nominee? Instead, it's just pile on the Times, which, again, as you suggested, has happened before.
Right. You know, look, I mean, I recall back to 2008, a campaign that you and I are both pretty familiar with. The New York Times misplayed its hand on two important stories, one about the Clintons' personal life and their marriage, one regarding John McCain's personal life. In both cases, by screwing up the way they did the stories, they allowed the Clintons on one side and the McCain campaign on the other to basically rally their supporters and their parties against the New York Times and effectively nullify and silence the Times. So this isn't the first time that it seems to me, just as a matter of tactics, the Times has done itself a world of damage by proceeding in the way it has. This should have been the first shot fired, not the previous story, which does seem kind of trivial by comparison.
You know, look, the Times still has this huge place in American journalism. Their stories get treated more seriously than anybody else's. They did some good work on this story, but they are also play this place for Republicans, and at least on the Democratic side for the Clintons, as people who can be, as a publication that can be beat up. It would be interesting to see if they back off Rubio or they keep their investigation going. I suspect it'll be the latter. All right, holy schnitzel, Batman. Jeb Bush was in Germany today trying to look like a President Bush, but not that President Bush. Here's what Jeb said in Berlin today about peace, coalitions, and democracy.
To resolve security challenges before they completely unravel, it will take a serious and united effort of the nations in our alliance. If events can be turned in the direction of peace, ladies and gentlemen, then who else but us? The great democracies of the West will do the turning.
John, we're going to look more at Jeb's speech. He did a Q&A today later in the program, but in short, on this day one of his 4-day European trip, did Jeb make a convincing case that he can perform on the world stage, which is what this trip is about?
Well, I think there's a difference here between style and substance, Mark. The speech was not well delivered. This has been a problem for Jeb Bush. Doing prepared speeches, reading from prompters, reading from scripts. He's not that good. He wasn't that good today. In terms of substance, he came across relatively moderate. He didn't sound like a neocon. He didn't sound like a wild interventionist. I think he will come across as relatively reassuring on the substance, but as I say, on the style, he still left a lot to be desired.
Look, he is a guy who can go in and give a substantive speech. As you said, the performance level may not be what it should be. Obviously, the bigger speech is Monday when he announces. But I do think that it's pretty clear that, as we talked about already on the show, this is a cautious trip. Jeb Bush is not trying to score points here so much as just simply punch the ticket to say, I've done this speech, I'm a serious person, leading up to his announcement.
Right. I mean, there was literally nothing. I mean, I read the speech. I've seen the speech. I've read the text. I saw the speeches delivered. There's literally nothing in it that anyone who was looking for a way to bash him for being too much like his brother. There's not a single sentence in there. He's tough. He's muscular. He's Republican for sure. No one's going to confuse him with Barack Obama. But at the same time, that was a very mainstream Republican speech, much more in the vein of his father's foreign policy than his brother's foreign policy. As you said, cautious and probably works to his advantage if that's what he's trying to do, avoid trouble on this trip.
You know, it's funny, for the course of Bush's exploration for most of this year, you've had the worst week he's had, the worst patch he's had, was over foreign policy, over the question of the Iraq war. I think in general, his best card has been the fact that he looks more like a president, acts more like a president than anybody else in the field. And I think in the end, that's going to be played at one of his advantages if he does win the nomination.
All right, moving on. Now it's time for what Gilligan's Island used to refer to as the rest. And today that's Chris Christie and Rick Perry. Both men have been spending tons of time in the early states. Governor Perry in Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. And Governor Christie also mostly, almost exclusively in the Granite State, where today he said he has the blessing of his family if he wants to run for president. Mark, much of the political class has already written these guys off for dead, but are either Chris Christie or Rick Perry showing signs of life?
There's no doubt that if you say to people, Christie can be the nominee, Perry can be the nominee in the political class, they laugh or shake their head. I think both those guys are working super hard. They both have something to prove. In Perry's case, it's almost certainly the last time he can run. I think they both are in this. If Jeb Bush, or if none of the top candidates becomes a formidable frontrunner, if this is a wide-open contest, those two guys, what they have in common, Perry and Christie, besides working hard in the early states, they're great retail politicians. And I think the voters are taking to them more than the elites are.
Well, it's a little unclear that that's true on the basis of the polling that we know about. There's not a lot of sign that either one of them has gotten hot yet with voters. But it's the case that what's interesting about the two of them is that they both suffer from the same problem. Rick Perry became a punchline in 2012. Chris Christie became a punchline over Bridgegate. I think, amazingly, I think Perry's path back is more probable in the sense that at least Perry is good with the Republican base. Christie has to fight both the headwinds of becoming a punchline, a bad economy in New Jersey, and the fact that he's out of line with where a lot of Republicans are in those early states.
The one thing that I haven't seen either of those guys do in great amounts, although Perry's doing some of it in Iowa, is organize. It'd be interesting to see if either of those guys takes their time on the ground to really get in there and organize. But I'll say again, you mentioned the polling. Where was Rick Santorum in the polling at this time 4 years ago? Both these guys are laying the groundwork. If they add in organization, I think they're both the kind of guys who can get hot at the end and be a factor in this race.
This is a much tougher field than 2012, a much tougher field.
All right, up next, we take you inside the Chicago courtroom where Dennis Hastert was just arraigned with two people who were there, one of them including me. And then the full breakdown of Jeb in Deutschland after this. The big political news here in Chicago today was the arraignment of former House Speaker Dennis Hastert on 2 felony counts, structuring cash withdrawals and lying to federal investigators. And this was the scene there today. In some ways, pretty typical, standard for an initial court appearance in a high-profile case, a classic perp walk, cameras swarming around, and a pretty short proceedings, a not guilty plea from the defendant. But there was a lot of human drama inside the courtroom because of the identity of the defendant and because of the allegations around the charges. Our guest tonight is Natasha Korecki. She writes for the Chicago Sun-Times. She and I were both in the courtroom today when Hastert was arraigned. Thanks for coming in to talk about this. First of all, describe the scene outside the courtroom, both in the lobby of the Federal Building and outside, compared to when Blagojevich was on trial and other things.
I would say it was very similar to when Blagojevich came in for the first time. More intense because we haven't seen Denny Hastert at all since these charges came to light. He's been very quiet. We didn't even know who his lawyer was until last night. So I say that probably contributed to being just much more of a circus today. Yeah. He barely was trying to get out of his car, trying to move, and I just kept hearing his lawyer say, "Oh my God, oh my God." People were just crushing him.
It was a circus, but there was and there was a lot of tension, I felt, but also solemn because of the nature of the allegations, the nature of the charges around it. All right, so in the courtroom, Hastert came in and sat there for a while, around 10 minutes or more, until the proceedings started. Talk about how he looked as he sat there for the first time in public in the courtroom, flanked by his two lawyers.
Well, he looked pretty uncomfortable. He looked like he couldn't wait to get out of there. Some people were saying that he was a little fidgety. We thought that he just looked, at one point I think he had both hands, and he was looking down, just kind of like a stunned man, like, why am I here and how can I get out of here as quickly as possible?
There was a very solemn look on his face. He mostly stared straight ahead as I saw him. And there was at one point in conferring with his two lawyers, one of them said something, and the two of them smiled and left out a little laugh, and Hastert did not break that very, very stern look that he had on his face. All right, so he pled not guilty. He didn't speak. His lawyer did. Talk about the proceedings and what struck you in terms of what actually went on besides the not guilty plea.
Well, the actual proceedings of not guilty plea was, predictable, pretty typical in this stage in the case. Probably what was the most striking was the judge, Thomas M. Durkin. The Durkin family is very well known here in Chicago. One of his brothers is the head of the Republicans in our Illinois House, so they're very well known politically. And that was probably the most compelling part of the hearing, arguably.
The judge for a long time explained his connection to the Hastert family. One of Hastert's son worked at his law firm. His brother, as you said, is a big political guy. The judge himself has given political donations to Hastert, although he said he didn't know him. He said, basically, he went through the basis for accusal. He said, basically, I'm going to recuse myself unless both sides say I shouldn't. Why doesn't he just recuse himself? I mean, it seems to me for a normal person, you've got a high-profile case, the judge shouldn't be someone who's given donations to the defendant.
Well, as he pointed out, he did that when he was a private citizen. One thing I thought that was really compelling was when the judge said, I did contact your staff when you were a congressman and asked to be a judge, I didn't hear anything back. Yeah. And here he is now in front of him.
But even that, you could say, the guy wanted to be a federal judge badly enough that he's now a federal judge. Just seemed odd to me. During this long proceeding where Hastert spoke briefly, occasionally would murmur, yes, sir, to questions from the judge, he stood pretty ramrod straight, his hands clasped in front of him, listening to the judge and following the proceedings. I was struck by the fact that this is a guy who was Speaker of the House, an international figure in the sense that he's third in line to the presidency. I was struck by how timid he seemed. His shuffle, the way he held himself, similar to when he was Speaker, but he seemed, again, kind of a timid guy in the proceedings.
Right, and as you said, you could barely hear him. I think all he said was yes, sir, to a series of questions. And yeah, I agree that was very striking. But again, here he is. I mean, these allegations are incredible, and they are that he spent an incredible amount of money trying to hide the secret. And if that is true, here he is for the first time, and this thing is out. So you can imagine, all eyes are on him. Right. What's going on there?
So in the legal proceedings, they talked about the one thing, he's free on bond. and they said they're guns that his sons keep in the house and safe. They need to get the guns off the property. Otherwise, what do we know about when the next legal proceeding will be, when the discovery, trial proceedings, or possible plea deal? What do you know about any of that?
Well, we don't have any hint on a plea deal. They did not mention that today. That was one of the things I was looking for, because sometimes when these discussions are farther along, they might make a reference to it in court. We did not hear that.
Would the federal prosecutors be reluctant to engage in plea negotiations in this case? It seems an obvious case for a plea deal.
It does seem an obvious case for a plea deal for the defendant, and I think that generally the prosecution, when they can avoid trial, they will, because it's a sure thing then. The next immediate thing is 4 o'clock deadline that the judge set for whether they recuse him. And getting back to that, Thomas Durkin is seen as sort of a friendly attorney in general to defendants. So it's going to be an interesting thing to see here, because Denny Hastert might not want to roll the dice and get somebody who's very pro-prosecution.
And the way the judge has set this up, either side can basically say privately, we want you off the case, and then be off the case. Lastly, your paper and others surely are still looking into the questions, not of the charges necessarily, but the facts around there. So there's going to be more to come on the question of how Dennis Hastert lived his life, right?
Certainly, and there's been now reports of 2 different individuals who are alleging that they are, victims of Denny Hastert. Whether there's more to come there, we'll see.
All right, Natasha, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it. After the break, Ich bin ein Berliner, Jeb Bush style, when we come back.
Jeb Bush is days away from announcing his official run for president, and his preamble is all about making him look like a world leader by visiting other parts of the world. Today he gave a speech in Berlin, and here with me to break it down is Albert Reinhold Hunt Jr., citizen of the world. Al, I want to move to these excerpts from the speech real quick. Let's get to the first one here of Jeb Bush talking about, in a grand overarching way, about the importance of alliances in the world.
70 years after America and Western Europe began to build the post-war architecture of security, that alliance is as relevant as the day it was founded. Who will say otherwise as we watch the fate of Ukraine slowly unfold in tragedy? And who wishes that we had less military strength and credibility at a time when Iran stands on the threshold of becoming a nuclear-armed state, and when it continues to support terrorism and foment instability in the Middle East? Who else but us will build the global effort to meet the threat of a terrorist army that now holds large parts of Iraq and Syria?
Al, not quite 8 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, Barack Obama went to Berlin when he was a candidate for president and talked about the importance of alliances. Here's Jeb Bush talking about the importance of alliances. What do you think about the tone of that and the substance of it coming from a Republican in this point in time?
Well, it's interesting. There have been great speeches by Americans in Berlin.
Yeah.
JFK, Ronald Reagan, Obama, as you said 7 years ago. This will not join that list. He did no harm, as Mark said earlier. He didn't do a Romney, he didn't insult anybody. But it's interesting that he talked about alliances when you compare it to the Obama speech 7 years ago, because that's exactly what Obama talked about. But Obama did it in the context of criticizing George W. Bush's administration for their unilateralism. And I think that Jeb Bush, by instinct, is going to be not closer to Obama's foreign policy, but much more of a multilateralist.
You think so? I mean, there's been, I remember when you heard his first big foreign policy speech, you thought, boy, he sounds a lot like George W. Bush. He's a neocon through and through. This speech has a slightly different tone, sounds a little different to you than that one.
It does, because I'm not sure, despite the record, that W was really a neocon. I think Cheney dragged him there. The second term, he was certainly less of one.
The Condi term.
Right, exactly. And I think that there have been no policy differentiations, domestic or foreign, between Jeb and his brother.
Right.
But I do think his instincts will be much more of a he'll be much more like the second Bush term than the first Bush.
All right, let's listen to let's catch the next piece of sound here in the next video. Here's Jeb Bush talking about a very pertinent issue for Germany and, in this moment, Russia.
There should be a clear understanding of first of all, our support for the Russian people, that we need to make it clear that while Mr. Putin is a ruthless pragmatist, he will push until someone pushes back, that we should never do it in a way that pushes Russia away for a generation of time. That ultimately Russia needs to be a European nation, and that everything we do ought to be to isolate its corrupt leadership from its people. We're beginning to realize that the reset button didn't turn out so hot.
Okay, so there's a little sting in the tail there, a little shot at Hillary Clinton with the reset button, but by and large, that's a pretty nuanced statement. That is not the most kind of bellicose rhetoric towards Putin that you heard among Republican presidential hopefuls.
It sure is, John, and who can argue with the reset button being off the track?
Yeah.
I mean, that's absolutely right. It was much more measured. It was really, I think, probably more realistic. We need Russia for a lot of things. We need them for Iran. We need them for Iraq. We need them for Syria and climate and other things. And it was really a lot less saber-rattling than I think some of the Republican right would like to hear.
Do you think that that kind of thing will come back? I mean, I know it's not obviously a gotcha thing, but do you think that among his Republican rivals and potentially Republican voters, that they will look at him and hear that and say, boy, he's kind of a softie?
I think it'll be thrown back at him by some of his rivals. I don't think that's going to be a determinative issue, at least at this stage. If Russia does something bad, perhaps.
All right, let's listen to Jeb.
If they further do something bad.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure that's coming too. Well, let's listen to our last clip here, Jeb Bush talking about his dad.
And you will understand if I note as a point of personal pride that my dad, my father, the greatest man I've ever met, the greatest man alive in my humble opinion, when he was president, worked very closely with Chancellor Kohl as East and West came together. That unification, as you all know, was not inevitable. Many doubted. Many of the leaders of Europe doubted. Many people even in this country doubted, in the United States as well, doubted whether it should be attempted. But Chancellor Kohl was adamant, and my father was deeply supportive. The work was done today, and because of that, Germany is whole and Germany is free.
Interesting, the praise for his father, not in the prepared text. He ad-libbed that. What do you think the motivation was for him to talk that way about his dad in front of this audience?
To identify on foreign policy with Bush 41. If you look at that, if you look at that record, first Gulf War, success. Managing the end of the Cold War, absolute success. German unification, success. As opposed to Bush 43, where you can't find any foreign policy successes. You guys know a lot more about politics, but let me tell you something about math. If you could get from 41 to 45 without going through 43, Jeb would be in better shape.
Okay, Al Hunt, I don't think I could top that. That's a fantastic point. I love it when Al Hunt comes here and does math. All right, thank you, Reinhold. Love to have you always. Up next, the best headline of all time. We'll be right back. Millions of years from now, after we humans inevitably destroy each other, aliens will visit Earth and dig through the artifacts we've left behind. And there is no doubt that even they will be impressed with this. The wood of the New York Post from April 15th, 1983, headless body and topless bar. The man who wrote that headline of headlines, Vincent Mussetto, died today in the Bronx at age 74. He may be the only headline writer whose name ever makes it into a story. Even today, headless leaves us speechless.
Instant classic that stood the test of time. All right. Remember, we're on twice a day at 5 and at 8. Or if you're using the metric system like Lincoln Chafee, that's 5 and at 8. Until tomorrow, for John in D.C., me in Chicago, we see you soon. Sayonara.